So Tino, the microphone is yours.
Thank you,
Welcome
everyone.
and thank you.
Thank you for having me. Just going to do some basics. It's not going to be a very technical discussion. So I'm also going to try not to say any buzzwords that might flag our video once it's posted. So if you hear me say some, alternate words for the disease that's occurring right now or a technology that's going to be used, we can imply what it really is. So I'm going to try and keep it as basic as possible because I know many of you may not have training in cell technology. And that's going to get a little bit more intense by about mid-presentation. And we can take questions after, as Sylvain said. There's a little bit about me here that you can read upon later. Nothing too special. You may have seen me around social media. Most of my activism has been letter campaigns and that sort of thing. I know there's a recent letter for a business letter that I just wrote that was quite popular, and many of you had asked for it, and I appreciate everyone helping. I'm a member of a couple of groups. We do an expert panel activist chat, which comprised of medical, legal, nutritionists, some vaccine experts, Hugs Over Masks, Mothers Against Distancing, Vaccine Choice Canada. You've probably seen me hanging around there as well. And I've done a few mask council presentations for Brant County and KW Region in Ontario. And that's probably where you may know me. Otherwise, I don't consider myself, any more active than most of you. There's quite a few of you that have taken the lead on this. Many of you, and I appreciate all of you that have, traveling the world across Canada and building our movement. So I really look up to all of you, Sylvain included, for doing your activism, your letter campaign to Parliament. That was awesome. And I took part in that as well. So you asked me to start with a memorable quote. And I've been using this for quite a while because I want to bring a sense of urgency to what we're doing here. And it says, when the soldiers are walking the streets, it will be too late. And I get this sense from many of us. I feel like there's about 40% of us that are awake to it, but maybe only 10 to 15% that are actually making a difference and getting out and calling their parliament or Congress people, getting out in the streets and that sort of thing. And when that time comes and there's soldiers walking the streets, take it for what you will. Maybe it's martial law, it'll be policemen or whatever. It's going to be much more difficult for us to get back what we have. So that's my quote to start off. And now we're going to get into the presentation. What is E.M.F or E.M.R? E.M.F is an acronym for electromagnetic field, or it can also be said as electromagnetic radiation. And it's more or less a result of electrical activity for the most part. And it resembles like a bubble of energy that's propagated in waves. Like if you were to throw a stone in a pond, you would see the waves ripple out. The energy is most focused at the source and then attenuates or diminishes as it gets further away from the source, from the energy source. So this is kind of what it looks like. The field would be circulating around the antenna, and it could go for miles. It depends on the power source, it depends on how strong the signal is. And the field could be alternating current, AC, which is what you would find at your outlets in your home, but it would be at a much higher frequency. Or it could be a static, like a battery, like a direct current, and the field would be more or less constant. And I'll explain what that means and the significance of that later. From a cell tower, it would look something like this. If we're looking at a cross section, looking at it sideways. So imagine this being a donut, a ring around the entire cell tower. Most of the energy is focused at the tower, and as you see the colors, it's getting gray and less intense as you're further away from the the cell tower, of course. Just like a speaker, your stereo system, as you get further away from the speaker, the energy, it becomes less. It's just the way the atmosphere absorbs some of the signal, or it bounces off objects like trees and the ground and that sort of thing. So it's better to be away from a cell tower, of course, as you're going to see later on in the presentation. You may have seen many of these along the streets, and the beam can also be directed. It doesn't have to be like a donut shape. They can also direct the beams, and this is how the cell companies can produce a certain coverage over an area. So you get like cone-shaped beams coming from the antennas, and that's why you see several antennas wrapped around the pole, because they're directing a certain amount of energy at a certain location. And if they didn't want coverage in a certain area, they could move one of the antennas or remove them totally. And that's how you get your coverage pattern, more or less. You know, frequency and amplitude. Frequency it's a measurement of an event over a specific period of time. So if we were to, let's say, our meals per day, if most of us have 3 meals per day, and the period would be the day, and the event would be the meals. So 3 meals per day would be considered a frequency of 3. In electrical terms, that would be 3 hertz. But in electrical terms, it's measured in a period of 1 second. So the next slide shows us an example of a sinusoidal wave. You can see it starts at the intersect, it rises up to a peak, it comes back down, and it goes to a negative trough, and then ends again at the intersect. And that is 1 full cycle. That is 1 event per second, or 1 hertz. So when you're hearing all these terms like gigahertz and megahertz, that's where this is coming from. So instead of being 1 cycle per second, you're going to see much higher frequencies for cell phones and cell towers, up in the millions and billions of events per second. And you can see here in the middle, you see the difference. That's showing about 20 cycles per second. So you can imagine what 1 billion cycles per second would be. It would be a much more compacted wave. And this is our spectrum, our known spectrum of electromagnetic frequencies, starting right down from 0, which is direct current, which is like a battery source, all the way up to gamma rays and that sort of thing, which you'd see in, you know, let's say outer space, or X-rays and that sort of thing. But we're going to focus on the gigahertz region, radio waves, microwaves mostly, and their effects on the body. Less than 1,000, less than a kilo would be hertz. Kilohertz would be less than 1,000,000, and so on and so forth. Now, as you get higher up in frequency, you may have heard the term millimeter wave. Because the event has to complete more times in 1 second, the length of that wave must decrease. So the millimeter wave term, I'm just going to back up. If you look to the right, you can see everything's more condensed. The wave has to be shorter in order to complete multiple times per second. So that's where a millimeter wave comes in, and we're going to talk about how that affects us. Okay, we're going to go back here to terminology. The peak of the wave is positive, and that positive energy is going to attract the opposite charge, which would be a negative charge. So this frequency, this pulsing, is going from positive to negative at a very rapid pace. So the field is changing polarity very rapidly, and that's causing a lot of disruption. So if you can imagine somebody flipping you upside down 1,000 times per second, you would be very agitated, angry, and most likely would break you apart into little pieces. As we talked about before, the distance away from the source makes a big difference. The power decreases as you are away from the antenna, which I explained before, and therefore the further you're away from these towers, the better. So in our atmosphere right now, there are hundreds of thousands of frequencies through the air coming into our homes and all that sort of thing, but they're at very low, what's called an amplitude. And you can see at the bottom of this slide, there's a cell phone, and on the left of the cell phone, there's a very low amplitude signal. The amplitude means the strength, basically. The cell phone needs to amplify that signal in order to use it, and then send it back to the cell tower. So it's going to increase that energy in order to get from your house to the closest cell tower, which could be hundreds of meters away. And most of us are using these cell phones and placing them near our heads, which we'll see later, not a very good idea, and I'm going to show you what you can do to minimize that radiation going into your body. And another thing, I was researching this topic, the code for, I believe it was the USA, was a minimum of, I think it was 600 feet from a residential building. And everywhere I go, I see apartment buildings with cell tower or cell antennas and radio antennas at the top of the building. I'm not really sure how this is legal. There are many studies, which I'm going to show you later, that tell us these frequencies are very harmful and carcinogenic. A power level as little as 2 watts, which is 1/10 of a light bulb in most homes, can do severe damage to your tissue. It can heat it up. I'm going to show you another chart here as well. But first, let's go over, we're going to put everything together now. Hopefully I didn't go too fast, but when you review the video, it'll be a little easier to follow. As you remember, as the energy comes up to a peak, the positive energy is going to attract a negative opposite charge. So what we're seeing right now is a water molecule, and it's being pulled toward the top of the peak wave. And then, depending on how fast the frequency is, let's say this is going to be 2.45 gigahertz. 2.45 gigahertz is 2.45 billion times per second. So imagine that water molecule flipping upside down 2.5 billion times per second. It's going to get very hot because it's going to be rubbing against other water molecules, and that's basically how a microwave works. It heats up the water by flipping it upside down rapidly. It gets very hot because it's the friction as it rubs against the other water molecules, and that's how the food is heated up. Now, you'll also notice 2.45 is what's used in microwaves because that particular frequency can penetrate into the food and not only cook the top layer, but also cook the middle section, like the steak, the interior part of the steak, for instance. So it can go beneath the top layer of the skin as well. And you'll notice at the bottom we have other household devices which work in the same range as a microwave. The difference is, as I mentioned before, the power level. The microwave is going to use a much higher power level. However, a cordless phone, baby monitors, and that sort of thing, they can still penetrate the skin. I believe it was 1 centimeter, and we can look that up later. So we have to be careful now how much power these devices are putting out and how much exposure we have. I know we used to use baby monitors for our children, and I'll never do that again, and I suggest everyone take more research into this. And if you're using a baby monitor now, perhaps maybe don't do it. Especially if it's on all night, it will be transmitting that frequency, around your baby, and I don't recommend that. And you'll see in the studies, you'll probably agree with those studies and not want to do that again. The next term I'd like to touch on is resonance. If any of you have seen, the singer, the opera singer, they hit a certain note and the glass breaks or cracks. So everything has its own frequency, its own natural frequency, and when that frequency is matched by another frequency propagating through the air, you get what's called like a standing wave effect. It's kind of like doubles itself, and it keeps doubling itself, so to speak, and it begins to vibrate all of the particles that are in that frequency range. They get very excited, they begin to shake, and that's how the glass breaks. And if you also play guitar, pick up your guitar and sing a tone into the sound hole, you'll notice when you stop singing, if you're hitting the proper note, one of the strings will begin to vibrate. So if you can imagine, in our body we have, several different types of particles that have different frequencies. And if those frequencies are met within our body, the same type of phenomenon can happen in tissue, in blood cells, and that sort of thing, where they get excited, they start moving around, causing heat and heating up. And heating up tissue is not a good idea, of course. And we're going to touch on that a little bit later as well. So now we're going to get a little more technical. And as you see here, we've heard a lot about a certain frequency in this new technology. The new technology boasts a higher frequency range for faster transmission, longer or wider bandwidths, and that sort of thing. And what's troubling about this frequency is you'll notice at the very center of the graph, it's 60 gigahertz, 60 billion times per second. We have an oxygen molecule, O2. And what this graph is showing is the oxygen is absorbing this wave. It's attenuating the wave. And to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And if you want to ask yourself, if you were designing a cell tower system that had to send cell signals through the air, which frequency would you rather use? Would you rather use something at, let's say, 15 toward the right of the graph on the x-axis, or maybe a little bit further up, let's say the 20 gigahertz, where the wave can travel longer with less energy, as opposed to 60 gigahertz. So that's very curious to me, that oxygen is reactive at 60 gigahertz. It's resonant. And what happens is when you're flipping the oxygen molecule at 60 billion times per second, it's going to heat up. It's going to start to tear itself apart, so to speak. The electron is going to separate, and you're going to get what's called a free radical. And if you studied a little bit of nutrition and biology and that sort of thing, you know that free radicals, when they enter your body, they want to attach themselves to another electron, because the outer shell, the electrons in the outer shell, want to be paired up with another electron. So an oxygen molecule that is now separated in a single oxygen atom, when it enters the body, it's going to attach itself to perhaps some sort of tissue, or who knows what else. Let's just say tissue for now, and it's going to stress the body. Oxidative stress and inflammation and that sort of thing causes disease. So we have to ask ourselves why we have these frequencies damaging the oxygen that we're breathing, as we already have other free radicals to consider. that are going into our body and causing oxidative stress. I'd like to ask the cell companies why we're going to be using this frequency range, as it's very concerning. As you see here, this is from Wikipedia, but it's also in many other scientific studies. At 60 gigahertz, between 1 and 300 gigahertz, the heating of body tissue occurs. And there's quite a bit of devices that are used in our society that operate in that region. And another thing that I came across, which I found very, I'm going to say, fascinating. The symptoms of radiation, if you look on the left, this is sourced from the Mayo Clinic, but you can find it pretty much anywhere else. The symptoms are the same as flu symptoms and this current disease that we're battling. Weakness and fatigue, fever, headaches, and that sort of thing. So our cell phones and other devices are causing the same symptoms as the flu and our nice new disease that we're locked down under. You have to ask yourself why the symptoms are the same, and if there is really something floating around in the air making us sick. We all know that there's been theories of the outbreak in Wuhan that may have been connected to cell phone radiation. It's a theory, but I'm going to show you some evidence that may make it more plausible. So here's a logical twist. If the radiation could present these similar symptoms in our bodies, is there really a virus that is making us sick? And we've also heard back in May, I believe it was, blood clotting. They discovered blood clots in the patients that were coming into the hospitals. It was reported on many, many news sources. And another funny fact about radiation, which is sourced in this government study, is after just very little time, 10 minutes used on a cordless phone, never mind a cell phone, but a cordless phone, the blood cells begin to group together like a clotting type of structure or formation. So now we have 3 symptoms of radiation that resemble the same thing as this current disease. Now, whether it's related or not, it's a very funny coincidence, but we also now, we should be very concerned about the current cell technology that we have and what we're going to be moving toward. I can provide several documented studies. These are all, I've gotten some of them from the National Institute of Health, CRTC, FCC. There's some quite compelling evidence here that we can present to make a case, and hopefully somebody will listen, because I think if we move toward this sort of new technology, we're going to be in for some very damaging effects. And you don't have to take my word for it or these studies. If you own an iPhone, this was taken from the iPhone menu. If you go to your settings, about, legal, and RF, you will see this warning here. Basically tells you not to put the phone to your head. It gives you all the limits in the exposure time, the SAR, the absorption rate, which your body takes in a certain amount of radiation before it's considered damaging. I consider all absorption damaging, so the government puts these funny numbers down. I don't know what they use as their limit, as their cutoff point, but most of these tests are done on animals, so I'd really like to know how much it affects a human. And we're going to get into how to protect ourselves from that near the end as well. This is a current, you can see the number there in red if you look to the bottom right. All the red zones are the current coverage. Now I want you to know that the current coverage is using a frequency a little bit lower than 60 gigahertz. It's around 25 to 39 gigahertz, which is still harmful, but it's not really affecting the oxygen at this point. But they plan on covering most major cities by the end of the year, and I think by 2021 they want to have us all plugged in, all our devices. So we're going to see more towers, and we're going to see more energy injected into our atmosphere. I found this to be quite shocking as well. Just in Toronto GTA Core Center, there are over 6,400 cell towers just in that area. I mean, I don't know how many there are all over Canada and US, but that's pretty alarming that we would have such a high concentration of radiation in, in just the downtown area of Toronto. So, just another point, as you add more towers, you add more radiation, of course. Power is additive. So, you know, you put another 500 watt antenna on there, it's another 500 watts being radiated. And I don't know how many more you can put up before we start seeing some really obvious effects. These are the current providers in Canada. And as I say, they're not operating at the full upper band, which is the 60 gigahertz, but they're operating at a lower to mid band, which I already said was, I'm pretty sure it was 25 to 39 gigahertz. And by 2021, we have all these other providers want to get on this network as well. So it would be great if we could hit all these people and give them a little bit of our concern. I see a lot of discussion about cell towers and whether they're, you know, the old technology or the new technology. The old technology is just as dangerous as the new stuff, but you can't really tell. There are certain giveaways for the new technology, but you can't really tell unless you have a very expensive meter that can measure those higher frequencies. Most civilian store-bought meters will not read that high. I believe this one's only good to, I think it's 20 gigahertz. And most of the ones that you'll see on Amazon and that sort of thing are only good for like 5 gigahertz. Not saying you shouldn't buy one, but don't think that you're reading those very high frequencies. I think there's a reason they don't want us measuring these frequencies, and they're not available to most of the public. You would have to be some sort of industrial supplier, I think, or, you know, have some links to the government, perhaps military, to get the really strong, high reading meters. And here's a question I've been asking myself, and I want to pose to all of you. Can we live without this technology? It's become, to me, it's become almost a thing of comfort to have our phone with us. Like, we can't leave the house without it. If there's an emergency, we feel like we're gonna, we can't survive. And we used to live quite comfortably without our cell phones. I mean, I still remember the days we left the house, jumped in our car, and went shopping, and we had our little list written down on a piece of paper. I've personally gone to a lower cell plan. You see here on the right, I'm only paying $20 here. I want to get off these networks. If I need to access the internet for any reason, most places have Wi-Fi beaming into our heads already, so we can always jump on a Wi-Fi signal. But I've taken the initiative. I've dropped my cell plan down to pretty much basic. I don't want to be giving these companies any more of my money that is going to be going into this technology. And I'm going to come to the point now where I'm just going to leave the phone at home, because we all know that there's tracking going on. You don't necessarily need your GPS sensor to be turned on. They can still trace you and track you and triangulate you with cell towers. And it's interesting to note that the military's had a land-based GPS, so to speak, a land-based navigation system back in the 60s, which used cell towers only, and it was quite effective, and it's still being used today. So you really don't even need satellites. Excuse me. You really don't even need satellites to locate your position on Earth. Everything is uplinked from the tower to a base station and then up to a satellite. Your phone or the cell tower or whatever device, even your GPS unit, does not transmit directly to a satellite. You don't have enough power in your cell phone to go through the clouds, and I mean, I can barely get a cell signal from my house to the cell tower about a kilometer away. There's no way my cell signal is going up to a GPS or my GPS sensor in my phone. So please know that any GPS-based device is being transmitted to a local cell tower, then to a base station, and then uplinked to a GPS. If you have a Wi-Fi router in your house, you may be able to turn down the power. I have mine on the lowest setting. If you look down at the bottom, you have, on this device, there are 3 settings. Mine's always on the lowest, and I also turn it off at night. My house is 99% RF free, except for our router, which it's only used during the day. If you cannot turn it off with your software, you can buy a mechanical timer, which you see up here in the top right, and just set it to shut off while you're sleeping. There's no need to have it on while you're sleeping. I mean, unless you're downloading something for a project, of course, but they can be shut down and turned on every day. A lot of people are connecting their devices to their phone. I know a lot of families that have automatic lights. They can change their temperature from their cell phone. They can check their doorbell from their cell phone. If you have this sort of thing, just know that the 2.45 gigahertz that most of these devices are working on can penetrate your skin, and long exposure periods are harmful. Another thing I meant to mention earlier, if you have those wireless earphones that work on Bluetooth, you have 2.45 gigahertz in your ears, very close to your brain. I would suggest taking them out and not using them. And when you're using your cell phone, try to use speakerphone. Don't put it up against your head. Use a speakerphone whenever possible. I have a landline. My house is using a corded phone. Whenever I make a call, I use my corded phone. My cell phone is hardly used. I use it mostly for texting, if I do. And when you're calling me, you're pretty sure you're on speakerphone. I never have it up to my head. I encourage you all to start using your speakerphone if you have to. Your TVs are also, many of them now, the new ones, smart TVs, have Wi-Fi. If you can hardwire it to a network cable, please do that, and then go into your menu and turn off the Wi-Fi signal. Just reduce as much energy going through your house as possible. And your car. I think this is my last slide. The car, most of us have newer vehicles, I would think now, that have some sort of Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or GPS. Even the sensors now can tell you if you're veering off into a different lane, or a radar sensor to tell you if there's a car coming up beside you. There's quite a bit of frequencies being generated from our vehicles, and it's more confined because obviously the car is smaller than your home. Sometimes we're in our cars for a couple hours a day, stuck in traffic. If you can contact your dealer or look up on the internet how to turn off some of these devices, might be a good thing. I'm trying to turn off the Wi-Fi in my car because I don't use it. Sometimes you may even have to replace the stereo unit because it's all integrated. And just keep that in mind. Your vehicle is probably, it's the most dense if you have a newer vehicle with radiation pollution. A lot of frequency going on. in our vehicles these days. If you want to protect yourself, besides everything I mentioned, a lot of foods have what's called ORAC value, oxygen radical absorbance capacity, and this will clean out the free radicals. It will help inflammation and oxidative stress in your bodies. So you can look this up on Google. I won't get into nutrition. That's out of my field of expertise, but I have talked to many in our movement that are nutritionists and doctors that can recommend things. If you want, I can turn you on to some of those people. But I highly recommend even some supplements. You can look on the specific supplement for an ORAC value. The higher the value, the more effective it is at clearing out your body and repairing oxidative stress. So in my closing remarks, strength in numbers, if we can get more than 10 to 15%, if we can get more than 1 or 2 people sending emails to Congress or radio stations, they'll take us more seriously. If you were just to get one email in your inbox, you might delete it. It might not even take effect. If you saw 10 to 20, it might raise an eyebrow. If you saw thousands coming in every day until things were fixed, I think, even if they don't do anything while they're reading their script, that these radio announcers and TV broadcasters, if they know that there's hundreds of thousands of people writing them and they don't believe the stuff they're saying anymore, it might be a little tougher to swallow their script as they're reading it. So please, encourage your friends and family to watch this video and other videos that you have. I know it's difficult. I try to do it with my family, and it's a very sensitive subject. But I try and sneak it in, and we need to get up and do something soon, or we're not going to have the ability to do that. So I'd like to talk about some action plans after all your questions, if you have any. I saw a few come up, so I'm going to close my presentation, and if you'd like to talk, let's discuss some action.